still trickling in, but maybe we'll get started and people will kind of come in while I have my opening remarks. So good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Amy Hariani. I'm Vice President and Global Policy Counsel at the U.S.-India Business Council. We're so pleased today to have with us a number of experts who are going to brief us on the executive orders that have been coming out from the Biden administration, particularly impacting some of the trade and commerce we're seeing in the U.S.-India corridor. And now that the administration has really gotten its legs, start to see more of this and what it means and maybe what it portends to come for your business and companies on the line. So just a few housekeeping things. As Jasjeet mentioned, we are recording. So this will be recorded and we will be putting it up on our YouTube channel for folks to watch later. And happy to send it to you separately also if you want the link. And then also we will take questions at the end. There's two ways you can ask questions. You can either use the raise hand function and ask your question verbally with your camera or mic. And there's also a chat box, so you can feel free to put your question inside the chat box as well. So let me briefly introduce our speakers and then we'll jump right into the substance of the program. We're first joined by John Murphy, who's Senior Vice President for International Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. John directs the U.S. Chamber's advocacy relating to international trade and investment and has been with the Chamber since 1999. He's led successful campaigns to win congressional passage of various trade agreements, including Colombia, Panama, South Korea, and Trade Promotion Authority. John also plays a key role in the Chamber's advocacy for international business priorities before Congress, the administration, foreign governments, and the World Trade Organization. So thanks for joining us this morning, John. We also have with us Pat Togney, who's a partner at King & Spalding's International Trade Practice. Pat represents clients in international trade law matters, including trade remedy proceedings and related appeals, customs compliance, and export controls. Pat is a member of the firm's coronavirus team and has advised clients regarding business and legal issues raised by the pandemic, including importation and exportation of personal protective equipment. Pat has also worked with clients on a variety of projects in connection with the Trump administration's approach to international trade policy, including China tariffs, Section 301, and the miscellaneous tariff bill legislation. So thank you, Pat, for joining us. And also joining Pat is Mike Taylor, who specializes in trade remedy, anti-dumping and countervailing duty litigation, customs, compliance issues, and international shipping matters. So we'll also hear from Mike. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over first to John to give us a little bit of the lay of the land. Why are we seeing these executive orders? What is kind of the theme underlying some of the thinking of the new Biden administration, and what does that mean for your business? I'll ask everyone, if you're not speaking and questions at the end, to please keep your mics off, and we'll certainly get to you, save lots of times for questions at the end. So thanks, John. I'll turn it on over to you.
Amy, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to join the group today and to be here with Pat and Michael as well. I'm looking forward to their comments. So the Biden administration's trade policies are just beginning to take focus. Certainly, this is an administration that's come to office with a strong focus on the domestic economy, starting with responding to the pandemic, bringing that under control, getting vaccines in arms as rapidly as possible, and also addressing other economic dislocations like the surge in unemployment that we saw in connection with the pandemic. But trade policy probably won't wait. Yesterday, per statute, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative issued the President's 2021 trade policy agenda. It's a bit of a retrospective at the past year, but mostly setting the tone looking forward. It's usually limited when we have a new administration because as of today, we don't have a confirmed USTR in office. But I do encourage everyone to go to the USTR website, and you can read, the executive summary pretty quickly. It sets the tone for what the Biden administration will be trying to accomplish in trade. There's a lot in there about their focus on creating a worker-centric, trade policy that addresses issues of equity. It's a little bit quiet on new trade agreements, but you do see in there the recurring theme that we've been hearing from the Biden administration about a desire to work more closely with allies, and possibly some hints that we may see a different approach to tariffs in the next few years. When it comes to supply chains, the area that's our main focus here, and I know Pat and Mike will get into more detail on this. The Biden campaign had a lot to say about supply chains and their interest in addressing what are perceived to be shortcomings there. There was a pretty detailed plan issued during the campaign, and now today we see the Biden administration beginning to execute on that plan. It arises from the perception, and in some cases the reality, that the pandemic caused some significant and painful shortages of key goods. And I'll just name a few just to kind of illustrate the challenge here. So take, for instance, nitrile gloves. These are the rubber gloves that doctors use. They were in shortage beginning of the pandemic. They're still in shortage. One of the challenges here is that 60% of the world's supply is produced in one country, Malaysia. And for whatever reason, countries such as the United States have not really been able to boost their supply. So that's a pretty concrete example of supply chain shortages because demand rose so dramatically. And now let me name a different one, the N95 respirators. These are the iconic masks that are used, that are the very high quality filters. According to the U.S. International Trade Commission, though, this is a product where 80% of what the United States consumed prior to the pandemic was made here in the United States. It's not an instance where production was offshored and the United States was left flat-footed and in shortage because of that action. Rather, it was because, to some degree similar to gloves, demand for the product rose 40-fold during the pandemic. And so that distinction maybe suggests a different public policy response. Now let me name a third set of products, medicines, pharmaceuticals. There are 20,000 FDA-approved medicines on the U.S. market today. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has an office that tracks shortages. And before the pandemic, just to give you kind of a baseline, that office said there were about 100 of the 20,000 that were in shortage. Fast forward to the first wave, say April, May of last year, and that number had barely budged. So that's an example of a sector where for most products, the supply chains are geographically diverse, and we did not see shortages, except for a small number of specialized drugs that were used in with respirators, for instance. So these are different realities, and you have to understand them before you move forward with actions to try to fix a problem, right? Now, in the CARES Act passed by Congress second quarter of last year, there was funding provided for a National Academy study to look at supply chains. There's been many other studies as well. In December, the U.S. International Trade Commission had a study on medical goods supply chains. And what the Biden administration is doing now is trying to leverage some of those, other ones on semiconductors, and have its own review. My colleagues on the panel will get into some of the details, but there's a 100-day period for review of a small set of products, and then over the following year, a deeper dive across half a dozen different ones. So I won't go into detail on that. What is the intended outcome of this? We might expect to see different policy tools used for different kinds of products. So take semiconductors, for instance, which is one of the products on the list. This is a sector that's been much studied. There's been major U.S. government commissioned reports on this before. There's a sense that for the very high-end chips, the United States is not today offering the kinds of incentives required to see that production conducted in the United States. It's not really so much about competing with China and its vast subsidies. It's about keeping pace with countries such as Singapore, Ireland, or Israel. So there is broad support in Congress today for funding the so-called CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Act was included in legislation that was signed into law in very early January, but it hasn't been funded yet. But this would create a 40% refundable investment tax credit, which would be the kind of subsidy for new high-end chips fabs that we haven't really had in the United States before. So that's a distinctive approach to one sector. Another one that I'll mention is, so I mentioned on supply chains, when it comes to medicines, 70% of the medicines consumed in the United States by value are manufactured in the United States. And for the innovative pharmaceuticals, the vast majority that we import, the other 30%, are coming from countries such as Europe, by and large. However, when it comes to generics, it's not necessarily like that, and particularly when it comes to the active pharmaceutical ingredients. So this is an area that the administration is focusing on. Now, the challenge here, though, is what's the policy tool to address it? As with my example regarding semiconductors, it's not really that obvious that Buy American is really the tool for the job. On the contrary, we think that could really backfire, particularly if other countries take similar measures. If you talk to the generic industry, for instance, the Association for Accessible Medicines, they have called for long-term guaranteed price contracts as the kind of incentive that would be needed in order to support the investment to produce more generic pharmaceuticals in the United States. A facility like that typically costs $1 billion. It takes 5 to 8 years to build. And simply saying that we're going to have a Buy American rule for the 3 or 4% of the U.S. market that is U.S. federal government purchases, as opposed to the private sector, that's not going to cut it. Buy American is not the tool that will get the job done. So again, different policy approaches for different sectors, and we have to understand that in some cases supply chains have, by and large, worked really well. In fact, if you look back at the pandemic, some of the areas where we had the most shortages, for instance, in some food products, we were dealing with almost entirely domestic production chains, whereas in the example of pharmaceuticals, for instance, the shortages were minor. So with that quick overview, I'm happy to get back into some of these topics from the chamber perspective as we go on, but I hope I've set things up for my colleagues on the panel to give a deeper dive into these executive orders.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks for that overview. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Pat Togney with King & Spalding, who's going to jump a little bit more into exactly what's contained in these executive orders and how companies might be able to manage and respond to them. And I think Pat is also sharing a presentation. I hope everyone can see that.
Yeah, Amy, can you see it on the screen?
Yep, I think we're all good. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks, John, for the great introduction. As John said, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the 2 executive orders that are on tap today. The first of those is more on the Buy America side of the coin, as John teed up, and you can see it's an executive order on ensuring the future is made in all of America by all of America's workers. And you can really see from the title that kind of proves up one point that John made at the top, that there are some very clear domestic policy issues that are driving the Biden administration's approach to trade in large respects, including government procurement. And the key takeaways here, I think, especially with so much yet to be decided with respect to how this executive order is going to play out in terms of regulations and actual bidding in the future, is it suggests an intent by the administration to try to harmonize the approach to the various Made in America laws that have been on the books for generations. Implicit in that is also to try to develop a more unified approach across all of those agencies as to how requests for waivers of those requirements are going to be acted upon in the future. And to that point, there's actually a new Made in America office that's being created with within the Office of Office and Management and Budget, that is designed to serve as a clearinghouse for all those waiver requests that might come in across the agencies in the months and years ahead. The executive order does also call out the potential for a new notice of proposed rulemaking on these issues that would really follow on very closely on the heels of similar action that was undertaken by the Trump administration last year. It's not clear at this time whether that's actually going to take place, either according to that schedule or in what form or fashion. But I think for Indian companies, what's really interesting to think about in that context is in calling out the potential for this new rulemaking, the Biden administration, through this executive order, teed up potential new ways for thinking about the domestic content requirements that could be employed for government procurement purposes. And in particular, there is the potential to think about domestic content in ways that are tied to the value that's added in the United States through US-based production or US jobs that result in the United States from those procurement activities. So whether that leads to, for example, Indian origin goods being allowed to participate in certain bidding under these programs in the future because it has a resultant impact on downstream stakeholders in the United States is something to keep in mind. Again, just some key takeaways here, and it may be surprising, but on some of these trade issues in particular, I do think there's less daylight between former President Trump's administration's approach and the Biden administration's approach. On a very high level, I think John did a great job of articulating some of the key differences. In particular, the Biden administration wants this new approach to be hand in glove with pursuing certain domestic political objectives in the United States. Something that we'll get into a little bit later in the context of the other executive order, I think a key takeaway for you is there seems to be a different type of whole of government approach here. You see, for example, in the context of this executive order, as it comes to potential public interest waivers that may be granted in the future, the order instructs the OMB office to assess whether, and actually the granting agency to assess whether any portion of the cost advantage that may be gained by those foreign source products actually resulted from dumping or subsidized imports into the United States. And that would call on the expertise of the Department of Commerce, who, as many of you know, is tasked with assessing whether certain imports are benefiting from subsidies or are dumped into the United States market. As you go back to the stakeholders within your company after today's call and debrief them on this, I think one key takeaway to share with them is, look, at the end of the day, when you're managing compliance risks in the context of government procurement, you really need to know, and the first question should always be, what does that particular contract or bidding document say? Because those are the requirements that are going to control your ability to potentially participate in that stream of business. Let's turn now to the executive order on America's supply chains. You can see here, we just took a snippet of the policy statement at the top, but again, it talks about resilient supply chains and the need for them in the context of things which shouldn't be surprising to any of us given the times that we live in terms of pandemics and biological threats. But it also talks about new wrinkles to consider, including climate shocks, extreme weather events, and things of that nature. Importantly, for our purposes, we wanted to call out this particular statement in the policy, which again, John teed up at the beginning of the call. The Biden administration is really calling out for close cooperation on supply chain resiliency with friends and allies, and is trying to do so in a way that can foster collective economic and national security, but also leave the world in a better position to respond to disasters and emergencies. So let's unpack the guts of the order a little bit for you. And again, this is at a very high level, but we wanted to follow on John's introduction. As John said, there's two streams of work that are going to come out of this executive order on supply chain review. The first is a more intensive, shorter time period, 100-day supply chain review on four key areas, ranging from semiconductors and advanced packaging to batteries and electric vehicles, critical minerals, so the guts of many of these high technology products, the key inputs that you see in other buckets here, and pharmaceuticals and API. And you'll see that there are different agency heads that are tasked with being the tip of the spear on the preparation of these reports. But implicit in this framework is that they we'll need to work with other stakeholders across the government to put together these reports for the president. The reports themselves are actually going to go into President Biden under a cover memo that's prepared by folks at the National Security Council and the Economic Policy Office. And they've actually been tasked with reporting out additional findings if necessary. So following on from that intensive 100-day effort, we're going to see a longer-term 1-year sectoral supply chain assessments in 5 areas, from defense, technology, energy, transportation, and also agriculture and food. And you can see that we've provided just a little bit more background for you if you want to take a closer look at that after the call in terms of some of the topics that they need to be covered. For your purposes, and in particular as the Chamber thinks about ways to engage with stakeholders on this, it's important to appreciate that none of these definitions, none of these buckets are necessarily set in stone. I think the Biden administration appreciated, number one, that certain critical or key goods and materials necessarily could fall in more than one bucket, but also the contours could change over time as developments warrant or as more information comes in. In particular, we just wanted to call out that the executive order suggests that for digital products in particular, I think the Biden administration appreciates that while it may merit its own bucket, is probably something that's going to be relevant to several of the buckets that we discussed. So you're probably thinking, well, what are some of the things that these reports are going to address? And again, you can look at these after the call, but we wanted to have them here for you as a reference point. And not surprisingly, a key driver is going to be an identification of what are the critical and essential goods and materials that are actually funneling up into the U.S. economy through that supply chain. And on the other side of the coin, a key consideration is going to be, are there bad actors or otherwise unfriendly or unstable nations that hold the lion's share of the current supply chain that is going to need to be addressed in some form or fashion. As I said earlier, climate change also factors and is a required element that needs to be addressed, which appears to be a noteworthy departure from prior supply chain analysis efforts. Now, here's where I think this gets back to some of the points that John made at the top. Are what shape is this going to take for purposes of engaging with the administration in ways that addresses some of the important roles that the U.S.-India trade relationship might already be providing in some of these key supply chains. And importantly, the executive order actually calls out for the stakeholders in the government that are going to be putting these reports together to engage with allies and partners to see what they're doing. Have those countries or industry segments already identified critical or essential goods and materials? And have they addressed any potential policy recommendations to ensure the ongoing resiliency of those supply chains? And again, this is just another example from the executive order that, again, explicitly calls out on those agency heads and their other stakeholders that are going to be helping them to put these reports together to anticipate working with these types of stakeholders in the weeks and months ahead. Under the executive order, there's also going to be some follow-up reports that will be provided to the president. They're designed to summarize actions that were taken over the prior year, but also make recommendations for future actions. And again, just to underscore what I think should be a key takeaway for you today is, again, this aspect is designed to, engage with allies and partners in a way that potentially can lead not only to strengthen supply chains for the United States, but also to improve supply chain resiliency in those countries of allies and partners around the world. And again, one final point here, especially at the outset of an administration, there's so many actions taking place on a lot of different fronts, and that's true here as well. And this is just one part of a much broader effort. In fact, I think the day after President Biden was sworn in, there was an executive order on a sustainable public health supply chain that was issued that I think will necessarily have some spillover effects with this supply chain executive order, in particular as it relates to API and pharma in general. So with that, I'll be pleased to turn it back over to John. Actually, one final point, John, I forgot, and this is just something that we teed up earlier. This is just a quote from Catherine Tai. You had mentioned, John, that she is the nominee for USTR. I think she's actually going to be voted on tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, but you'll see that whether it's with regard to supply chains or U.S. Trade policy more generally, what she said in her confirmation hearing was, look, our policy needs to be rethought in a way that has resiliency in mind across the board. And I think that this executive order is just another example of that. So with that, John, I'll turn it back over.
Thanks, John. I think we were going to have you just give a little bit of an update for the folks on the line about how the chamber is thinking about responding to some of the requests for comment and stakeholder consultation that Pat referenced, both from a chamber point of view, and then I think I also saw in there that individual organizations can certainly also put in comments, so either on their own or working with good experts like Pat and Mike to do their consultations, how companies might be able to basically provide input. And then also, would you mind giving the audience a bit of a flavor on the allied nation and what some of the thinking is on that as well?
Sure. Thank you. So maybe on the last point first, so what is the benefit of being a U.S. ally in this context? The Trump administration talked about this as well. They had an initiative that the State Department was running called the Economic Prosperity Network. The idea was that it would identify trusted trading partners that would, and some kind of special benefit would be conferred in connection with supply chains there. But it was never really defined. And I think industry was kind of left scratching their heads. And I think today, as the Biden administration wrestles with these issues, it remains an open question. What does it mean to be a trusted partner of the United States? So one issue I think is worth mentioning that hasn't come up is the WTO government procurement agreement. To date, the actions that have been named, the executive order on supply chains, the executive order on Buy American, have deferred to U.S. commitments that we've made as a party to the WTO government procurement agreement. So in the way those agreements work, certain sectors and coverage is identified, sometimes with specifics relating to individual federal agencies, and in some cases states as well. I think 39 different states have commitments under this. And the United States has agreed not to discriminate against firms from those countries that are GPA partners in the procurement. And the Biden administration has said that they're not going to muck around with all of that. They may at some point come back to this and seek to renegotiate some of those commitments, the exact details of the coverage. But that's a possibility that hasn't really been defined yet. Now, India is not a party to the GPA, so India does not receive those benefits. So I think that's worth keeping in mind here as we think about the path forward. Now, how exactly is the chamber going to engage? On both of these executive orders, we expect rulemakings to take place in the regular way. Here in the United States, of course, that's a Federal Register notice will solicit comment from the private sector. Industry and other parties that want to submit comments will do so. The chamber will work with its members to gather that input and submit it. Sometimes there's hearings, and then rulemakings follow from that. So in a sense, even though we have these two big executive orders that we've been talking about here today, nothing's really happened yet on these fronts. It sets the stage and the direction, but it's those rulemakings that will dig into it. So, for instance, when it comes to Buy American, sorry, I was just trying to get the detail here. So the Trump administration, just to give you an illustration of how this works, the Trump administration on January 19th issued a final rule that tightened some Buy American rules. And just to give you a little of the color of how that worked, there are rules that set the domestic content requirement for goods to be deemed U.S. originating. Previously, there were 50%, and the Trump administration raised it to 55%. That's an example of the kind of thing that you might see come out of a process like the one that is just starting today. So it has to do with the domestic content to meet the threshold. Another thing that was done in that same final rule is the rule raised the so-called evaluator preference for those products. For U.S. firms, it was 6%. It was raised to 20%. So that's an advantage that domestic companies would receive in bidding, that they'd be more likely to win thanks to that price preference for the American companies. So that's what applies across the gamut here for products that are not covered by the WTO government procurement agreement, which is a subset of all American procurement. So the chamber will be, as these Federal Register notices come out soliciting input from the private sector, we'll be working with our members to provide that kind of input back. And as I was saying, these are very different realities from sector to sector. And I think that what we have to say back to the administration, it could be kind of complicated. We may have different answers for different sectors. I was just hearing from an auto industry source about the battery issue, and in the United States, the U.S. auto sector, which is highly integrated with Canada and Mexico, and is still working to digest the new rules put in place by the USMCA. That's going to be a complicated reality there, where they're already changing their supply chains for batteries in an industry that's undergoing rapid change. And how those rules, which are just being digested, how that interacts with new rules on Buy American for batteries for EVs, that's going to be pretty complicated.
Thanks, John, for that. And it's helpful to know that officially the clock hasn't sort of started for comments. So this gives some people some time to work with their organizations to think through, what they might submit through their trade associations like us, or on their own, or with other groups. So that's really helpful. I guess we will keep an eye as the Federal Register notices come out and share with our members as well. Great. Well, we have about 25 minutes left for questions. We really wanted to give everyone the chance to ask questions if they have any. So again, if you do have any, you can use the raise your hand function, and I'll call on you, or you can also put them in the chat box and I can help read those questions out. So I'll give a few seconds here to see if anyone has a question, and may also kick us off too.
Sure. And Amy, this is Mike. While you're waiting on the first question, just to put a little color on the Buy America provision, Pat, I thought, did a nice job, as well as John. The Buy America executive order, if you take a step back, was really a lot of pomp. It was a lot of announcements and a new administration coming in. We don't know what the guts are going to be, as Pat said, until potentially a Federal Register notice comes out in July. The big issue, or the big announcement, was there's a new office that is going to try and harmonize the exclusions. And so you don't have Department of Transportation acting one way and Department of Energy acting one way and FDA acting another way. They want to be speaking with one consistent voice as to the exclusions to the best extent they can, which just makes some policy sense. But the other item to think about and appreciate is all of these changes in tests they're talking about are under the Buy American Act, not the Trade Agreements Act, which enhances the Buy American Act. And so that's for lower value contracts. So larger value contracts, there's a different test. It's a substantial transformation test that applies. So we're getting really in the weeds here, but I think we have to wait and see what happens into whether or not, for big contracts where there's lots of money on the table and lots of purchases being made, whether the test that applies in that context is going to be amended to allow and account for this U.S. economic activity. And there's a divide policy-wise. There are some people pulling for that in the United States, and there's some people opposing that. And so the opportunity to comment is going to be really important. And we're probably, to have an opportunity for comment, we're probably a year away at least before we know the answer to that.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for that. Okay, I think we have our first question. Pavan, if you want to take yourself off, and also if you could just identify yourself and who you're with too.
Yes, I'm Pavan Chaudhary. I'm the Managing Director of Vigon, a French multinational in India, as well as the Director General of Medical Technology Association of India, which is largely an association of global companies only. So I have two small requests. One is, if India's candidature as a trusted partner of US can be bolstered through the shared history of peace, a similar political dispensation which is democracy, as well as the ability of India to stand up against any rival of US in the Asian geography and honor its contracts and obligations to US. This is one request. I'm sure USIBC which interacts at the top levels, must be already doing this. And the second thing is that, as I understood from John, perhaps the generic export to US would not come under the under these two orders in a very stringent manner. Can this large-heartedness be leveraged so that the medical technology exports of US to India are also seen more reasonably in the sense that a very strong preferred purchase order, which is difficult to implement as well as dangerous for the patient, doesn't come into being here? John and then Amy.
John, do you want to take a stab? Go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I'm sure Amy has thoughts on this. So this idea of a trusted partner, it's enticing to think that India would qualify, right? I think it's incumbent on us to try to define what it means to be a trusted partner, because, as I mentioned, the Trump administration never did, not really, and other than, not China, that much was clear. And the Biden administration has yet to do so as well. And I think that these Federal Register notices seeking comment from the private sector will in part be an opportunity for us to say why that should be, why country X, in this case India, should be considered a trusted partner. I do think that the WTO government procurement agreement will continue to be an issue, though. And the Biden administration, which is a multilateralist administration, which continues to show deference for the rules-based trading system. Officials such as Secretary of State Tony Blinken repeatedly have said the United States wants to comply with its WTO obligations. Nonetheless, there is this somewhat contrary impulse as well of I suppose we might call it economic nationalist approach here. So that tension will be there. And I think India will be perhaps in not quite as good a position as the Europeans, who are members of the WTO government procurement agreement. And it seems very likely that U.S. officials will press that distinction.
I'll maybe just add on top of John's, I think there's going to be a lot of considerations, as John said, including the GPA, which may complicate things. But that notwithstanding, USIBC has been for a long time and more recently more vocal about why there are some already natural existing synergies between Indian and US supply chains that we need to make sure that we strengthen and reinforce. The pharmaceutical sector is a perfect example. There already is a fairly robust and kind of synergistic cycle between the US and India on pharmaceuticals. So the more that we can highlight that to the Biden administration in terms of showing the strength and resiliency that already exists in the US-India corridor, and I think will continue to be amplified, especially as API and other manufacturers look to diversify supply chains and look at markets like India why that could sort of be a sort of natural strengthening point and natural ally. So, we already, Pavan, are doing that. We'll do more of it in the time to come, but that still is notwithstanding some of the other factors like the GPA that we can't, overcome just by simply talking about the natural synergies. Pavan, you're on mute.
I said thank you very much. Really appreciate.
Thanks. All right. Anyone else have questions or comments? You can use the raise hand function or the chat box. And while we wait, I have one.
Yes, from Abby Pratt. It's in the chat there, Amy.
Oh, say that again, Justjeet.
There's a question from Abby Pratt in the chat box.
Oh, okay. Can you read it? Sorry,
know...
I don't see it. Go ahead.
Yep, I'll go ahead and read it. So do we know the extent Indian companies participate in the U.S. procurement market? And is it a large market for Indian pharma companies?
So, Amy, do you...
Mike or Pat, do you want to try a stab at that maybe?
Sure. Well, talking about pharmaceuticals, and again, there are a number of Indian companies who participate in the procurement market. It just, as Amy and John had mentioned, because the government procurement agreement, there often are exclusions, or you have to go in and explain what you're doing for the and why your product fits a need that otherwise isn't available. But in the pharmaceutical market in particular, there's a difference. About 4 years ago, there's a change. Most pharmaceuticals are acquired through government procurement in the United States by being listed on the Federal Supply Schedule, which is a schedule that is posted by the VA. And there's two different approaches to that. For innovator drugs or drugs under patent, the change 4 years ago was all companies had to list their products on the FSS to sell in the United States. And so you can, if you hold the patent, there's no issue. And in fact, you're required to list your product on the FSS so it can be made available and the government can purchase it. The difference, though, is that for generic products or products that are not under patent, as long as there is another product available that's manufactured in the United States, you have to identify whether you qualify as a government procurement agreement country or whether you actually source the product in the United States. And until a year ago, last February, that was driven by where the API came from. And if the API originated in India, then the product was Indian, and because India was not a member of the GPA, it was difficult to list on the FSS. You had to go through, you could get exclusions, but you had to go through a process to do that in order to sell into the government market. That changed, however, because of a federal circuit case, one level below the United States Supreme Court. There was a determination for, not for country of origin marking and not for classification coming into the United States for duty purposes, but for government procurement purposes. There was a determination that the API does not necessarily drive the country of origin. And so you could have Indian or origin APIs that are manufactured maybe in a different location, or there's some other manufacturing steps that happen, which meant that this rule that the government had used to say, where's the API from, for government procurement purposes, is now set aside, and it's a pharmaceutical specific analysis that has to be undertaken, which has created opportunities for new pharmaceuticals to be sold on that are not under patent to be sold to the government in some cases.
That was an excellent report there. I would just add that that discussion applies to the fraction of the U.S. market that is procurement. Of course, 95% of the U.S. market is private sector purchases, and Buy American rules don't apply there.
Yeah, absolutely, that's correct.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Justjeet, I can't see the chat box for some reason, so I'm going to ask you if there's other questions coming through there to let me know.
Yeah, no more at this moment.
Okay. I'll give folks another chance here to either raise their hand or put a question in the chat box. In the meantime, let me ask you all a question. I see here on the line that we have really a diverse set of members from Indian companies manufacturing here in the US and in India, American companies manufacturing in India and exporting out of India. Do these orders at a macro level, and I think, John, this is more for you, but others can chime in, do these orders make any distinction, or do you see kind of a theoretical distinction or flavor through any of the language the Biden administration is using in terms of favoring American companies versus Indian companies, or is this really more about where the manufacturing facility is located and the export streams coming out of that?
So, under U.S. law, a U.S. affiliate of a foreign headquartered multinational is a U.S. company, and as I painfully read little excerpts from the January 19th executive order, you can see that the Buy American rules try to come at the problem in different ways. One is to think about the good itself and how much of it is really American made. And another one is about the company. So, federal law, tries to take multiple cuts at this. I don't know if Mike or Pat have further comments on that.
Yeah, just in terms of the supply chain executive order, I think that there are going to be many opportunities for companies all across that spectrum that you just raised, Amy, to try to find their place in a way that makes sense, to explain to the administration that we contribute to resiliency in this particular bucket in the following ways. In particular, I mean, you could parse it a million different ways, but I think that it's clear that they are trying to strike a balance between domestic production capabilities and not running into the same types of situations that the country faced, and indeed the entire world faced during the COVID-19 pandemic. But I also think that there is this notion of resiliency that necessarily flows through allies and partners around the world that are a reliable source of supplies, and whether those ultimately are stockpiled in the United States or how they're procured, it's not clear at this point. But I do think that that would be part of the messaging that I would try to focus on, because it seems apparent just on first read of the order that there's not going to be kind of a wholesale decision to foreclose the notion of supply chain resiliency if it doesn't originate and in all material respects reside within the four corners of the United States. I think it's much broader than that.
I think that's well said, and I'll just underscore that. President Biden quite explicitly said that resilience doesn't mean that we're going to try to make everything here and make it ourselves. And other senior officials have made the same comments. But how do you get from those general comments to the specifics of a rulemaking? But it may be that here we have some differentiation from the Trump administration. In the pharmaceutical space, there was quite a lot of consternation in the middle of last year when President Trump was very critical of Ireland, which is, I think, for many categories of pharmaceuticals, the number one source of imports. And, Ireland, of course, is a country whose standing in U.S. politics is extremely high. And so for the president of the United States to suggest that products from Ireland are unsatisfactory in some way was a big deal. And so the Biden administration, I think, is certainly not saying that. So the focus on resiliency and partners, I think, is going to be a little bit stronger, is what we're hearing.
Thanks for that. I think, Pat, you make a good point in terms of companies wanting to respond to some of these, making their own case for their own unique dynamics, whether where they're located or what type of company they are or what they make. And of course, some of the other arguments that we will help flush out about the ally and good reason that, working with India and the Indian supply chain really are part of that, I think, factor that the Biden administration is looking for. So I appreciate that.
Sure. And one other follow-on point on that, Amy, that just occurred to me is that there is a notion of, as we talked about, climate change, but in particular sustainability. It seems to me that there are potential arguments that could be made. It doesn't seem, again, on first read, this could go in any number of ways, but it doesn't seem to me that the Biden administration's approach is to contemplate, 1,000 greenfield plants being set up around the United States to build out the production capacity in these important buckets. It may be in certain key areas that's a decision that's made, but in thinking about articulating a policy grounds for being a part of this sustainable and resilient supply chain, in other words, if there's manufacturing capacity that already exists in certain locations around the world that just so happen to be resident in areas of the world that are more closely aligned with the United States, I think that could be part of a forceful argument as well.
It's a really good point, and actually it's one of the areas where US and India are more closely aligned is on climate change policy. And so if that is being factored into it, I think, companies and, others could make the point that if that is a factor, India is using a lot of solar and wind and other alternative sources that may help the case in terms of climate change impact. Even if they're making, in India, it's still with a green carbon footprint, if you will. Jasjeet, I think we have another question that came in from the chat box. So if you want to share that.
This question is related to aerospace and defense. The first part of it is, what is the scenario for procurement norms in the aerospace and defense industry? If someone can provide some background on that. And the second is, would the new government be working towards fulfilling the requirement for meeting Indian offset requirements?
And unless someone else wants to jump in, I think this is an excellent pair of questions for our colleague Keith Webster, who's not on the call. So we can take them to him and get a call back there. He's forgotten more than I'll ever know about those topics.
Yeah, we can certainly get some more, information specifically on aerospace and defense. I don't know, Pat or Mike, if you have any immediate thoughts on that. Otherwise, we're happy to take it back and.
Just on the first part of the question is, I think it will be interesting to see on the supply chain side what happens in the reliance on allies, right? And you see the strong tie between India and the United States on aerospace historically with the recognition, and Mr. Chaudhary recognized it earlier. There are other focuses on Asia, and the United States and India are looking at other Asian countries and seeing what common interests they have. And so I think there is a unique area there where there could be some ties into building on. But we'll let the experts jump in on the actual offset questions there.
Got it. All right. Let me. I think. Any more in the chat box, Jasjeet, right now?
Nope.
Okay. Then I see you have your hand raised. If you want to quickly ask a question, and then we're going to wrap up.
So it's again not a question, Amy. It is a small request which I add to what I heard from John and Patrick on the resilience piece. That resilience doesn't mean that everything will be made in America. On that note, may I request that not only if we can be projected as legitimately as the trusted partner of US, if we could also be projected as the trusted manufacturer of US for products like electronic components, where US has significant concerns that malware should not come in from hostile actor countries into their country. So that is my request. And the last point is regarding electric vehicles and batteries, on which I will offline connect with Sandeep here.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Definitely take that into consideration and agree with your thinking on that. Great. I think so. As I mentioned, everyone, today's is being recorded, but we're happy to take up follow-up questions. And I know Pat and Mike will make themselves available if anyone wants to reach out to them. I'm going to turn it over to Jasjeet, who leads our supply chain and manufacturing work at the committee, to wrap up and also share with if anyone wants to get more involved in our work with USIBC or with the supply chain and manufacturing committee or other sector works as well, let us know. But thanks again to our speakers. Jasjeet, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Amy. And yes, thank you to our speakers first and foremost, from King and Spalding, Pat Togney and Mike Taylor, and obviously our friend from the chamber here, John Murphy. We'll continue to monitor these executive orders as they continue to come out. Some of them are coming out quite quick and often, as you can tell in the beginning of this administration. So we are monitoring them, and we will continue to do these sort of rapid response sort of events. So keep close watch on your calendars. We'll also keep monitoring these particular executive orders as they move through. As we discussed, some of them are in the very early stages, particularly by American, and we'd love to continue to involve our members in terms of the advocacy effort and not only the learning, but as we move towards actually relaying what our industry and our companies actually want and need. I think the Buy American program in particular, we're learning more quickly, and it's good to know we're at the beginning phases of that. On the supply chain, it seems to be a very important sectoral review that the government is going through, but India in particular is interested in, I think, all four of those areas, but in particular, pharmaceuticals, rare earth minerals, large capacity batteries. These are supply chain ecosystems which have been developed in the country, and the semiconductor chips are also coming along well in the Indian ecosystem. So I think there's a lot of interest from our companies, many of which are based in India. And we'll kind of continue to monitor, as I said, these executive orders as they come out. So thank you all today for joining. I think we're at time. Again, thanks to our speakers, thanks to our participants, and we'll be happy to continue the conversation offline. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.